The Romance for Trombone and Piano by Carl Maria von Weber is one of the earliest solo works for trombone. It is regarded by many trombonists as capturing the true ardor of the Romantic ideal. The work is also one of the very few pieces in the repertoire contributed by a name-brand composer other than the Hindemith Sonata and Bernstein Elegy for Mippi II. But did Weber even write the Romance, and was it even intended for performance on trombone? While much of the origin of this work remains shrouded in mystery, this discussion will concern the original instrumentation and will use intuitive measures in music analysis to suggest an instrumentation that aligns with facets of Weber's compositional technique and historical elements. For the purposes of this discussion, however, we will operate under the notion that Weber did himself compose the Romance for trombone. We'll start with the bad news. The Romance was almost certainly not written for trombone, principally based on anachronistic discontinuities. Weber's Romance makes remarkable use of the pedal range, such as the descending lines down to C2 in measure 23. Simple instrumental limitations of the trombones available during Weber's lifetime, 1786 to 1826, would not allow the player to descend to these notated C2. This is achieved by engaging the F valve, which lowers the fundamental of each position by a perfect fourth, so low F suddenly becomes low C. The F attachment came along in 1839, a bit after Weber's death, and certainly after the period in which Weber composed most of his solo instrumental literature anyway. Additionally, no other composer was really writing for trombone in a concertante setting during the early Romantic period. Given the opportunity to compose a solo for a bass clef instrument, it's certain that Weber would have opted for the bassoon or cello, as was the more common practice. So now we've narrowed down our bank of plausible solo instruments down to just the bassoon and cello, and the remainder of our discussion will focus on the viability of either of these instruments being the original solo voice. To better understand Weber's compositional style for each the bassoon and cello, we must compare existing literature for these instruments within the composer's body of work. The Bassoon Concerto in F, Opus 75, is Weber's only bassoon solo and will work well for comparison with the Romance. His solo writing for cello, however, is surprisingly inadequate, so we must find the best representation of his cello writing in the trio in G minor, Opus 63 for flute, cello, and piano. First, let's look at the similarities these two pieces share with the arcane Romance. The Bassoon Concerto is pitched in F major, taking advantage of the instrument's lowest pitch, B-flat 1, which acts as the 4 in that key, and a high D5, which is the tonic of the relative minor. The range of the cello part in the trio is only slightly smaller, 2 octaves and a major second. This is just one whole step larger than the 2-octave range of the Romance, meaning both instruments would have been able to execute such registral extremes with ease. It appears that the similarities between the selected works for bassoon and cello and the Romance all pertain to great contrasts in range. The outer movements of the Bassoon Concerto are flashy and contain extreme register leaps, larger than a tenth. For instance, the cadences of both antecedent and consequent phrases of the second thematic group or the ascent to D5 before the coda, both in the first movement. The trio demonstrates both extreme leaps, and even the ascent to D5, but also offers wonderful compound melodies in the cello, like those at rehearsal B in the first movement, and 14 measures after rehearsal D in the finale. The instances of extreme leaps in the Romance are used mainly in a melodic context, for instance, the octave displacement in the final statement. And while bassoons and celli alike are capable of performing in this way, Weber's writing for the former most closely resembles that of his Romance. Next, we'll attempt to make a case for each instrument as Weber's originally intended soloist. We'll examine the distinct characteristics of the bassoon concerto and the trio that indicate correlations with the Romance in melody and functionality. In terms of melodic shape, the bassoon concerto exhibits a unique similarity to the Romance more frequently than does the trio. In the concerto, we see something similar to the Romance's secondary thematic material in terms of shaping, with a long note value followed by a descending eighth note line on the second half of the bar. This is seen at page 5, System 4, measure 2 in the first movement, and page 16, System 3, measures 1 and 2 of the third movement. Another melodic resemblance is that found on page 6, System 3. Here is a melodic figure with descending sixteenths, followed by a figure in the upper tessitura, and ultimately modulated up a step upon its return. The similarity in contour and function is uncanny with the Romance's measures 22 through 26. The cello part of the trio offers only some melodic resemblance to the Romance, such as the moments of melody centered around a single pitch with close, stepwise movement. This is only present in the third movement, 5 measures after rehearsal B. But bears some semblance to the figure at measures 35 through 38 in the Romance. A somewhat tenuous similarity also exists in the downward chromatic stepwise line found in the fourth movement of the trio, 12 and 8 bars before rehearsal H. Though this motion is a bit pervasive in Romantic composition, its appearance at measures 65 through 66, and then again at measures 106 and 107 of the Romance, make it noteworthy. Lastly, the bassoon concerto was written mostly in the middle to upper register, with occasions of low melodic or scalar lines, more similar to the Romance. Whereas the trio treats the cello in an often subservient role. The latter is written largely in the low register, with some moments of melody in the upper register, though throughout it does seem the cello is relegated to providing a bass line. In fact, the cello part often doubles the left hand of the piano part, once again departing from the treatment of the soloist in the Romance. Based on the idiomatic nature of the writing and the similarity in melodic structure, the bassoon concerto seems to resemble the Romance better than the cello part of the G minor trio, and therefore might indicate that Weber originally wrote the Romance for bassoon.